Hello and welcome to MimiLeaks. Today I'm going to continue to read aloud the motion regarding immunity and whether it's applicable to the former president as argued by the prosecution. A quick update before I start. When I first started recording this series, I couldn't decide if I was going to read the entire 165-page document or if I was going to stick with the factual proffer, which is where the special prosecutor is presenting his evidence for the court to either accept or reject. The two sections following the proffer tie the legal basis with his legal basis with portions of the proffer. So it's a great deal of duplicate info, and while it's needed as a legal argument, it's perhaps a bit redundant to read and listen to. So I'll likely finish after we finish the proffer, section 1. It's page 80 something, so I'll probably finish at that point. But if the evidence as laid out isn't making sense in either direction, you may want to continue to read the rest of it on your own. So just wanted to mention that. And okay, please like, subscribe, share, and let's get started. D. The defendant organized and caused his electors to submit fraudulent certificates, creating the false appearance that states submitted competing electoral slates. By late November 2020, every effort, both legitimate and illegitimate, that the defendant had made to challenge the results of the election had been unsuccessful. The defendant, his campaign, and their allies had lost or withdrawn one election lawsuit after another in the 7 targeted states. And the defendant and co-conspirators' efforts to overturn the legitimate vote count through a pressure campaign on state officials and false claims made directly to state legislatures in formal or pseudo hearings continued to fail. So in early December, the defendant and his co-conspirators developed a new plan regarding the targeted states that the defendant had lost: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, to organize the people who would have served as the defendant's electors had he won the popular vote, and cause them to sign and send to Pence, as President of the Senate, certifications in which they falsely represented themselves as legitimate electors who had cast electoral votes for the defendant. Ultimately, the defendant and his co-conspirators would use these fraudulent electoral votes, mere pieces of paper without the lawful imprimatur of a state executive, to falsely claim that in this ministerial role proceeding Ultimately, the defendant and his co-conspirators would use these fraudulent electoral votes, mere pieces of paper without the lawful imprimatur of a state executive, to falsely claim that in his ministerial role presiding over the January 6th certification, Pence had the authority to choose the fraudulent slates over the legitimate ones, or to send the purportedly dueling slates to the state legislatures for consideration anew. The fraudulent electors' plan arc and obstructive purpose is reflected in a series of memoranda drafted in late November and early December by CC5, an attorney who volunteered to assist the defendant's campaign in lawsuits challenging the election in Wisconsin. Beginning with a memorandum drafted on November 18th, CC5 advocated that the defendant's electors' nominees in Wisconsin meet and cast votes on the dates required by the ECA. In 2020, it was December 14th, in the event that an ongoing recount in the state reversed the defendant's loss there. But this course of action, which CC5's Wisconsin memorandum presented as a contingency plan to preserve the possibility that the defendant's electors' votes would be counted at the January 6th certification proceeding if he prevailed in the Wisconsin litigation and won the state, quickly transformed into a corrupt strategy to overturn the legitimate election results. CC5 revealed this obstructive plan in 2 additional memoranda, dated December 6th and December 9th, which proposed that the defendant's electors' nominees in 6 of the targeted states, all but New Mexico, a state that the defendant lost by more than 10% of the popular vote, sparsely referenced in his false claim of voter fraud, and did not envision challenging at the inception of the elector scheme, meet on December 14th, sign fraudulent certifications, and send them to the Vice President to manufacture a fake controversy during the January 6th congressional certification. The defendant personally set the fraudulent elector plan in motion in early December, ensured that it was carried out by co-conspirators and campaign agents in the targeted states, and monitored its progress. By December 5th, the defendant was starting to think about Congress's role in the election process. For the first time, he mentioned to Pence the possibility of challenging the election results in the House of Representatives. In the same call, Pence told the defendant that the Georgia Bureau of Investigations was investigating their race. On December 6th, the same day that CC5 put the plan on paper, the defendant and CC2 called RNC chairwoman P39 out of the blue. P39 did not know CC2, and the defendant introduced them to P39 by saying that he was a professor and a lawyer. Thereafter, CC2 was the primary speaker during the conversation. CC2 told P39 that he and the defendant wanted the RNC, quote, to help the campaign assemble the electors in the states where we had legal challenges or litigation that was ongoing. In any case of the litigation changed the result of the state so that it would meet the constitutional requirement of electors meeting, unquote. When the call ended, P39 immediately called P3, one of the defendant's deputy campaign managers, and relayed her conversation with the defendant and CC2. After P3 assured P39 that the campaign was on it, P39 called the defendant back and told him to do so. On the same day, from his personal email account, P21 forwarded to the campaign staff, CC5, the November 18 memorandum and wrote, quote, "We just need to have someone coordinating the electors for states," unquote. And the following day, on the evening of December 7th, CC1 sent P39 a text message stating in part, quote, "I have lawyers assigned in each state working on December 14th electors meeting and what they need. I will send you a list," unquote. The defendant's co-conspirators worked with his campaign staff and used his pre-election campaign apparatus to execute the fraudulent elector plan. The defendant communicated with CC1 and CC2 about the plan, and they in turn communicated with CC6 and CC5. Ultimately, P5 and P19 and other campaign staff and agents helped carry out CC5's plans. On December 8, CC5 spoke on the phone with P53, a private attorney, whom CC1 and CC6 had identified as a contact for the plan in Arizona. Following the call, P53 recounted the conversation in an email. Quote, "I just talked to the gentleman who did that memo, CC5. His idea is basically that all of us, Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Pennsylvania, etc., have our electors send in their votes, even though the votes aren't legal under federal law because they're not signed by the governor, so that members of Congress can fight about whether they should be counted on January 6th. They could potentially argue that they were not bound by federal law because they're in Congress, Congress and make the law, etc. Kind of wild or creative, I'm happy to discuss. My comment to him is that I guess there's no harm in it, legally at least. In other words, we would just be sending in fake electoral votes to Pence so that someone in Congress can make an objection when they start counting votes and start counting the fake votes that should be counted," unquote. On December 9, CC6 contacted P39 for assistance with the request form from CC5 for, quote, "a list of our electors in each state and copies of the certificates sent in 4 years ago," unquote. P39 responded that campaign employees were already assisting in the effort and referred CC6 to P3. The next day, CC1, at CC1's direction, CC5 generated directions to the electors in all the targeted states, except for Wisconsin, which had already received his memos, and New Mexico, which he had not been asked to do, on how to best mimic the manner in which valid electors were required by state law to gather and vote, along with fraudulent certificates of vote for the defendants' electors to sign. The day before the defendants' electors were scheduled to meet and sign fraudulent certificates of vote, the defendant asked campaign manager P4 for an update on the elector plan and directed P4 to issue a statement. And CC1 asked P4 to participate in a messaging conference call. P4 discussed these developments in a text thread with P3, campaign staffer P54, and P9. After P4 proposed a communications plan for the campaign on the elector vote, P9 wrote to P3, quote, "I'll call soon and we'll talk with boss," unquote. The participants then discussed to whom a campaign statement could be attributed. P3 wrote, I went to the top. Okay, there it is. P3 wrote, "Here's the thing," quote, The participants then discussed to whom a campaign statement could be attributed. P3 wrote, quote, "Here's the thing, the way this has morphed, it's a crazy play, so I don't know who wants to put their name on it," unquote. P4 then shared with those on the text thread the invitees to the call CC1 was convening. CC1, CC6, P12, P19, P55, and P56, and derogatorily referred to them as the, quote, "Star Wars bar," unquote, meaning a motley assortment of characters, and in this case specifically ones whose professional competence P4 doubted, and with whom he personally would not choose to hire. P9 responded that they were certifying illegal votes. Thereafter, the text participants collectively agreed that no message would go out under their names because they can't stay by it. In the midst of those text messages, P9, P4, and P3 had a 19-minute phone call with the defendant. In practice, the fraudulent elector plan played out somewhat differently in each targeted state. In general, the co-conspirators deceived the defendant's elector nominees in the same way that the defendant and CC2 deceived P39 by falsely claiming that their electoral votes would be used only if ongoing litigation were resolved in the defendant's favor. A select few of the defendant's agents and elector nominees, however, had insight into the ultimate plan to use the fraudulent elector certificates to disrupt the congressional certification on July 6th. In several states, the defendant, his co-conspirators, and agents were unable to convince all of the defendant's elector nominees to participate. P57, for instance, a former U.S. representative and a U.S. attorney, and one of the defendant's elector nominees in Pennsylvania, who opted out of the plan, told the state party vice chair trying to organize the defendant's electors that he would not participate because the plan did not follow proper process and was illegal. When electors like P57 declined, the conspirators and agents had to recruit substitutes willing to go along with the plan. Other electors who participated based on the conspirators' false assurances that their votes were only a contingency were later surprised to learn that they were used on January 6th and would not have agreed to participate if the conspirators had been truthful about their plan. In Pennsylvania, the defendant's elector nominees' concerns about the propriety of the plan presented a problem for the conspirators. In text messages that P5 and CC6 exchanged on December 11th into the early morning hours of December 12th, P5 told CC6 that P46, the state Republican Party chairman whom the defendant had called shortly after the election, quote, "is winding up the electors, telling them if they sign the petition, they could be prosecuted. Need a counter argument or someone has to call him and tell him to stop," unquote. CC6 responded, quote, "Have someone who knows him call him to tell him to stop," unquote. P5 replied, quote, "That's the plan. Pennsylvania is squishy right now," going to need a call with CC1 tomorrow, unquote. On December 12th, CC1, CC5, CC6, and others held a conference call organized by the campaign to placate the defendant's Pennsylvania electors. CC1 falsely assured them that their certificates of vote would only be used if the defendant succeeded in litigation. During the call, some of the defendant's conspirators and agents exchanged text messages expressing frustration at the electors' concerns. P5 wrote, quote, "Whoever selected this slate should be shot," unquote. P12 responded, quote, "These people are making this so much more complicated than it needs to be, OMG. And, we couldn't have found 20 people better than this," unquote. P5 agreed, writing, quote, "We need good substitutes," unquote. When the possibility arose that the electors' certificates of vote include conditional language making clear that they were not yet the duly appointed electors, P5 wrote, quote, "The other states are signing what CC5 prepared. If it gets out, we changed the language for Pennsylvania, then it could snowball," unquote. On December 13th, the eve of when the electors were to meet, the defendant was preoccupied with preventing the certification of the electoral vote. He tweeted, quote, "Swing states that have found massive voter fraud, which is all of them, cannot legally certify these votes as complete and correct without committing a severely punishable crime. Everybody knows that dead people, below-age people, illegal immigrants, fake signatures, prisoners, and many others voted illegally. Also, machine glitches, another word for fraud, ballot harvesting, non-resident voters, fake ballots, stuffing the ballot box, votes for pay, roughed up Republican poll watchers, and sometimes even more votes than people voting, took place in Detroit, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, and elsewhere. In all swing state cases, there were far more votes than are necessary to win the state and the election itself. Therefore, votes cannot be certified. This election is under protest." End quote. Ultimately, the Pennsylvania electors insisted upon using conditional language in their elector certificates to avoid falsely certifying that they were duly appointed electors. And in New Mexico, the state that CC5's memoranda did not even address, the defendant's campaign filed a pretextual lawsuit just minutes before the fraudulent electors met so that there was litigation pending at the time of the vote. Notwithstanding obstacles, the defendant and his co-conspirators successfully organized his elector nominees and substitutes to gather on December 14th in the targeted states, cast fraudulent electoral votes on his behalf, and send those fraudulent votes to Washington, D.C., in order to falsely claim at the congressional certification that certain states had sent competing slates of electors. When possible, the defendant and co-conspirators tried to have the fake electoral votes appear to be in compliance with state law governing how legitimate electors vote. For example, the co-conspirators knew that some states required that the duly appointed electors meet and cast their votes in the state capitol building. To make it seem like they had complied with this requirement, the state officials were enlisted to provide fraudulent electors with access to state capitol buildings so that they could gather and vote there. In many cases, however, the conspirators and the fraudulent electors were unable to comply with state law for legitimate electors. For example, Pennsylvania law required governor to give notice whenever an elector was substituted, but the conspirators could not arrange for the governor to give notice when P46 and others opted out and had to be replaced. Thereafter, CC5 and others brainstormed fake excuses for their failure to follow state law, writing, quote, "Maybe we can use COVID-19 as an excuse for the governor not giving notice," unquote. Then, on December 14th, the date that duly appointed electors across the country met to cast their votes, and when the defendant's fraudulent electors in 7 states mimicked him, P39 followed up with the defendant. When she received an internal RNC email titled Electors Recap Final, which summarized the day's activities with respect to electors, and it included a list of 6 contested states in which the defendant's electors voted, she forwarded it to the defendant's executive assistant, P42, who responded, quote, "It's in front of him," unquote. P39 also asked the defendant to tell him that she had sent him the update, and she spoke to CC1 shortly before CC1 spoke to the defendant. At the same time that the defendant's fraudulent electors were preparing to gather and cast fraudulent votes, the defendant's co-conspirators began planning how to use the fraudulent votes to overturn the election results at the January 6th certification. On December 13th, CC5 sent CC1 a memorandum that envisioned a scenario in which Pence would use the fraudulent slates as a pretext to claim that there were dueling slates of electors from the targeted states and negotiate a solution to defeat Biden. On the same day, the defendant resumed almost daily direct contact with P1, who maintained a podcast that disseminated defendants' false fraud claims. On December 14th, P1's podcast focused on spreading lies about the defendant's fraudulent electors, including the false claim that their votes were merely a contingency in the event the defendant won legal challenges in the targeted states. On December 16th, CC5 traveled to Washington with a group of private attorneys who had done work with the defendant's campaign in Wisconsin for a photo opportunity with the defendant in the Oval Office. During the encounter, the defendant complained about Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice P49, who days earlier had cast the deciding vote in rejecting the defendant's election challenge in the state. As the group was leaving, the defendant spoke directly and privately to CC5. As late as early January, the conspirators attempted to keep the full nature of the fraudulent elector plan secret. On January 3rd, for instance, in a private text message exchange, CC6 wrote to CC5, quote, "Careful with your texts on text groups. No reason to text things about electors to anyone but CC2 and me," unquote. CC5 responded, "Okay," and CC6 followed up that they were probably being a bit paranoid. CC5 wrote, quote, "A valuable trait," unquote. The defendant attempted to persuade Pence to reject votes cast by duly appointed electors and choose the defendant's fraudulent ones. As the defendant's various attempts to target the states failed, and the January 6th congressional certification approached, the defendant and co-conspirators turned their attention to Pence, who, as president of the Senate, presided over the certification proceeding. In a service of a new plan to enlist Pence to use his role to fraudulently alter the election results at the January 6th certification proceeding, the defendant and his co-conspirators again used deceit. They lied to Pence, telling him that there was substantial election fraud and concealing their orchestration of the plan to manufacture fraudulent elector slates, as well as their intention to use the fake slates to attempt to obstruct the congressional certification. And they lied to the public, falsely claiming that Pence had the authority during the certification proceeding to reject electoral votes, send them back to the states, or overturn the election, and that Pence agreed that he had these boundless powers. With these lies, the defendant created the tinderbox that he purposely ignited on January 6th. The defendant first publicly turned his sights towards January 6th in the early morning hours of December 19th. At 1:42 a.m., the defendant posted on Twitter a copy of a report falsely alleging fraud and wrote, quote, "Statistically impossible to have lost the 2020 election. Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, will be wild," unquote. When CC5 learned about the tweet, he sent a link about it to another one of the Wisconsin attorneys who had met with the defendant in the Oval Office on December 16th and wrote, quote, "Wow, Based on 3 days ago, I think we have a unique understanding of this, unquote. Later, on December 19th, the defendant called Pence and told him have plans for a rally on January 6th and said that he thought it would be a big day and good to have lots of their supporters in town. The defendant and his co-conspirators recognized that Pence, by virtue of his ministerial role presiding over the January 6th congressional certification, would need to be a key part of their plan to obstruct the certification proceeding. On December 23rd, in a memorandum drafted with CC5's assistance, CC2 outlined a plan for Pence to gavel in the defendant as the winner of the election based on the false claim that, quote, 7 states had transmitted dual slates of electors to the President of the Senate, unquote, and proposed that Pence announce that, quote, because of the ongoing disputes in the 7 states, there are no electors that can be deemed validly appointed in those states, unquote. CC2 emphasized concealment, writing that the main thing was that Pence act without, quote, asking for permission, either from a vote of the joint session or from the court, unquote. CC2's memorandum stood in stark contrast to concessions he had previously made about the vice president's lack of authority in certification proceeding. 2 months earlier, on October 11th, he had actually written to a colleague that neither the Constitution nor the ECA provided on vice president with the discretion of counting the electoral votes or permitting him to make a determination on his own. And just 1 day earlier, on December 22nd, when asked by other private attorneys to provide views on a draft complaint that would, if filed, have raised the issue of the vice president's authority on January 6th, CC2 had recommended that the complaint not be filed. He wrote that, quote, the risk of getting a court ruling that Pence has no authority to reject the Biden certified ballots is very high, unquote. On the evening of December 23rd, after CC1 shared CC2's and CC5's plan with the defendant publicly retweeted a document called Operation Pence Card, which, like CC2 memorandum, advocated that Pence block the lawful certification of legitimate electoral votes. Also, on December 23rd, CC2 emailed P42, asking to speak with the defendant to update him on the overall strategic thinking. The following day, December 24th, the defendant called CC2 and they spoke for 40 minutes. Then on December 25th, CC5 proposed a text message to CC2 and CC6 that Pence permit an unlimited filibuster of the certification in violation of the ECA and ultimately gavel in the defendant as president. When CC2 asked, quote, is Pence really likely to be on board with this? Unquote, CC6 responded, quote, let's keep this off text for now, unquote. From that point on, the conspirators plotted to manipulate Pence. CC1, CC2, CC6, and P1 worked in concert to enlist Pence to act unlawfully and to ratchet up public pressure from the defendant's supporters that he did so. The defendant began to directly and repeatedly pressure Pence at the same time that he continued summoning his supporters to amass in Washington, D.C. on the day of the congressional certification. On December 25th, when Pence called the defendant to wish him a Merry Christmas, the defendant raised the certification and told Pence that he had discretion in his role as President of the Senate. Pence emphatically responded, quote, you know I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome, unquote. The next day, the defendant tweeted, quote, never give up, see everyone in D.C. on January 6th, unquote. He also tweeted false fraud claims, quote, time for the Republican senators to step up and fight for the presidency, like the Democrats would do if they had actually won. The proof is irrefutable. Massive late-night, mail-in ballot drops in swing states, stuffing the ballot box on video, double voters, dead voters, fake signatures, illegal immigrant voters, banned Republican vote watchers, more votes than actual voters. Check out Detroit and Philadelphia, and much more. The numbers are far greater than what is necessary to win the swing states individually, and cannot even be contested. Courts are bad. The FBI and justice didn't do their job, and the United States election system looks like that of a third world country. Freedom of the press has been gone for a long time. It is fake news. And now we have big tech with Section 230 to deal with. But when it is all over, and this period of time becomes just another ugly chapter in our country's history, we will win. Unquote. On December 28, when CC2, CC5, and CC6 exchanged text messages, CC2 expressed concern that Gohmert versus Pence, a lawsuit filed the day before that asserted that Pence had discretion to choose electoral votes during the certification proceeding, would prompt a federal court to publicly reject and thus preclude the plan that the conspirators were advancing in private. Thereafter, at 11 a.m. on January 1st, the defendant called Pence to berate him because he had learned that Pence had filed a brief opposing the relief sought in Gohmert. When Pence explained, as he had before, that he had not believed that he had the power under the Constitution to decide which votes to accept, the defendant told him that hundreds of thousands of people, quote, are going to hate your guts, and people are going to think you're stupid, and, quote, unquote, and berated him pointedly. Quote, you're too honest, unquote. Immediately before the call, the defendant had spoken separately to CC1 from 10:06 a.m. to 10:14 a.m. and P1 from 10:36 a.m. to 10:46 a.m. And late that afternoon, the defendant spoke separately with P1, CC2, and CC1. Within hours of the call with Pence, the defendant reminded supporters to travel to Washington for the certification proceeding, tweeting, quote, the big protest rally in Washington, D.C. will take place at 11 a.m. on January 6th. Locational details to follow. Stop the steal, unquote. The next day, on January 2nd, CC1, 2, and 6 appeared on P1's podcast. When P1 asked whether the January 6th certification, would be a climactic battle, CC2 responded that, quote, a lot of that depends on the courage and the spine of the individuals involved, unquote. The defendant spoke to CC1 shortly after his appearance on the podcast. That afternoon, CC6 worked to arrange a meeting among the defendants, CC2 and Pence, in order to enlist Pence to misuse his role as president of the Senate at the certification proceeding. When CC6 texted P1 about the meeting, P1, who had just finished a phone call with the defendant, reiterated that the defendant wanted Pence briefed by CC2 immediately. Thereafter, the defendant called Pence, informing him, quote, that he had spent the day speaking to a Secretary of State, state legislatures, and members of Congress, unquote. As described before on pages 29 through 31, the defendant spoke with Georgia Secretary of State P33 that same day. On the call with Pence, the defendant said he learned that a U.S. Senator was going to propose a 10-day delay in the certification proceeding and told Pence that he could make the decision to delay the count for 10 days. The defendant then referred Pence to CC2 for the first time and asked Pence if he would meet with him. On January 3rd, the defendant again told Pence that at the certification proceeding, Pence had the absolute right to reject electoral votes and the ability to overturn the election. Pence responded that he had no such authority and that a federal appeals court had rejected a lawsuit making that claim the previous day. Then, the defendant took to Twitter to again falsely claim that fraud had permeated the election. Quote, sorry, but the number of votes in swing states that we are talking about is very large and outcome determinative. Only the Democrats and some rhinos would dare dispute this, even though they know it's true, unquote. The same day, CC2 circulated a second memorandum that included a new plan under which, in violation of the ECA, the vice president would send the elector slates to the state legislatures to determine which slate to count. Y'all, I think I will forego the technical quote unquote every time we get to one because it's just so cumbersome. I don't know that the flow is the best. So I will say it interchangeably where I deem helpful for those listening and not watching. And if I don't, I will try my best to make it evident by changing inflection or something. So let's see how that goes. Okay, back to the motion. The meeting that CC6 had organized so that the defendant and CC2 could enlist Pence to reject Biden's legitimate electoral votes was scheduled late in the afternoon of January 4th. In advance of the meeting, CC1, 2, 6, and P1 gathered at the Willard Hotel in the White House, and from there, CC1 called and spoke with the defendant. When CC2 arrived at the White House for the meeting, P9 confronted CC2 about the legal basis for his proposal. P9 went line by line through CC2's second memo, and CC2 conceded that no court would support it. In response, P9 warned CC2 that pressing his admittedly unlawful plan would cause riot in the streets. P9 then spoke to the defendant, telling him that the theory that CC2 and others were promoting would not work, and that CC2 had acknowledged that it was not going to work. The defendant responded, "Other people disagree," but did not identify those other people. P9 also pointed out to the defendant that CC2's theory regarding a strategic Democratic plan to subvert the election was inconsistent with other allegations that had been floating around about C3 and foreign interference. The meeting among defendant CC2, Pence, and Pence staffers P8 and P58 began around 4:45 p.m. No one from the defendant's White House counsel's office attended. During the meeting, the defendant asked CC2 to explain his plan to Pence. CC2 presented two options. Pence could unilaterally decide objections to electors, or alternatively, in the plan that CC2 had advised the prior day, Pence could send the elector states to the targeted states' legislatures to determine which electors' votes should be counted. In the defendant's presence, in response to Pence questioning, CC2 admitted that the ECA forbade what he proposed and that no one had tested CC2's new plan to send elector slates to state legislatures for review. Nonetheless, the defendant repeatedly expressed a preference that Pence unilaterally reject valid elector slates. Throughout the meeting, the defendant repeated his knowingly false fraud claims, as a purported basis for Pence to act illegally. Pence's 5 pages of contemporaneous notes from the meeting reflected that the defendant said, quote, "When there's fraud, the rules get changed." Also, bottom line, won every state by hundreds of thousands of votes. And this whole thing is up to MP. Has to do with you. You can be bold and right to do whatever you want to do, unquote. The meeting concluded with Pence firm and clear, telling the defendant, "I'm not seeing this argument working." Nonetheless, the defendant requested that Pence's staff meet with CC2 again to discuss further, and Pence agreed. The conspirators were undeterred. Immediately after leaving the White House, CC2 gathered with CC6 and P1 back at the Willard Hotel. Over the days that followed, these conspirators strategized on how CC2 could influence Pence through the vice president's counsel and normalize the unlawful plan by discussing it on P1's podcast. Meanwhile, the defendant continued to pressure Pence publicly. For his part, immediately upon leaving the meeting with Pence, the defendant traveled to Dalton, Georgia, to speak at a political rally at the invitation of 2 U.S. senators engaged in runoff elections there. During his political speech, the defendant promoted many of the same falsehoods that he had previously been informed were untrue. He said, quote, "They're not taking the White House. We're going to fight like hell. I'll tell you right now," and remarked, "I hope Pence comes through for us. I have to tell you, I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much, unquote. He also used the Dalton campaign speech as a call to action to his own supporters, telling the crowd that if you don't fight to save your country with everything you have, you're not going to have a country left, and demanded that his supporters take action to prevent what he falsely called the outright stealing of elections, like they're trying to do it with us, emphasizing we can't let that happen. The next morning on January 5th, the defendant spoke on the phone with P1. Less than 2 hours later, on his podcast, P1 said in anticipation of the January 6th certification proceeding, quote, "All hell is going to break loose tomorrow," unquote. Also, in the morning of January 5th, CC2 participated in a federal court hearing in Trump versus Kemp, the Georgia lawsuit against P17 and P33, in which the defendant had signed a false verification days earlier. CC2, on the defendant's behalf, asked the federal court to decertify the presidential election in Georgia and declare that the state legislature may choose the state's electors. During the hearing, the federal court denied the relief requested. Immediately following the federal court's rejection of the legal basis for the conspirators' plan, CC2 went to the meeting that the defendant had requested that Pence's staff, P58 and P8, take. At the outset, CC2 changed his tack and advocated that Pence simply reject Biden's electors outright. This was contrary to his primary recommendation the day before, for Pence to send the slate to the state's legislatures, but consistent with the preference that the defendant had expressed. CC2 made additional concessions during this meeting. For example, CC2 agreed that the Supreme Court would unanimously reject his proposed plan. Consistent historical practice since the founding was that vice president never asserted authority to reject electors. No reasonable person would want the Constitution read that way because the office would never switch political parties. No state legislature appears poised to try to change its electors, and if the Democrats were to claim the same authority, CC2 would not credit it. P58 expressed to CC2 that the defendant's plan would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets. Having failed to enlist P58 in the criminal conspiracy, CC2 told him that the team was going to be really disappointed. The team, in fact, was disappointed. After CC2 updated CC1 on the meeting, CC6 confirmed to P1 that the Pence lawyer, that is, P58, was totally against us, prompting P1 to respond, quote, "Fuck his lawyer," unquote. That same day, CC2 received an email confirming what he already had admitted to P58. No chamber of any legislature in any state, including Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, was requesting that its electoral votes be returned to the state for review. Meanwhile, CC5, who had traveled to Washington as directed by the defendant's public messages, obtained duplicate originals of the fraudulent certifications signed by the defendant's fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin, which they believed had not been delivered by mail to the president of the Senate or archivist. CC5 received these duplicates from campaign staff and surrogates who flew them to Washington at private expense. He then hand-delivered them to staffers for a U.S. representative at the Capitol as part of a plan to deliver them to Pence for use in the certification proceeding. The defendant did not leave the pressure campaign to his co-conspirators. He redoubled his own efforts. And I guess he rebelled too, allegedly, according to this. On January 5th at 11:06 a.m., shortly before CC2 meeting with P58, the defendant tweeted the following: "The vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors and designate the defendant as the winner of the Electoral College vote." That afternoon, the defendant met privately with Pence in the Oval Office. During the meeting, the defendant once again told Pence, "I think you have the power to decertify." When Pence was unmoved, The defendant threatened to criticize him publicly. He said, "I'm going to have to say you did a great disservice." This concerned P8, to whom Pence had relayed the defendant's threat, to the point that he alerted Pence's Secret Service detail. Next still, the defendant initiated a phone call with Pence, P58, P8, CC2, and one or two other private attorneys, likely including CC1, and again raised the scenario of the vice president sending the elector slates to state legislatures. P58 again pointed out that such a strategy violated the ECA and that Pence reaffirmed that he did not believe he had the authority to do so. Shortly after that call that evening, at 5:43 p.m., the defendant tweeted the following: "I will be speaking at the Save America rally tomorrow on the Ellipse at 11 a.m. Eastern. Arrive early. Doors open at 7 a.m. Eastern. Big crowds." The defendant continued his pressure campaign on Pence that evening. After a New York Times article that night detailed the afternoon's private conversations in which Pence had rejected the defendant's demand to act unlawfully, the defendant directed P4 to issue a statement rebutting it and approved it at 9:28 p.m. Minutes later, the defendant called Pence and told him, "You're going to be tough tomorrow." After concluding the call with Pence, the defendant sequentially spoke to P1, followed by CC2. Then, at around 10 p.m. that night, the defendant issued the public statement, which read the following: "The Vice President and I are in total agreement that the Vice President has the power to act." And this is a statement that the defendant knew was a lie from Pence's repeated and firm rejections of his efforts, but that gave false hope to the defendant's supporters arriving in the city at the defendant's request and maximized pressure on Pence. Okay, guys, that's where I'm going to end it today, since the next part goes into the events on January 6th. So the next video in the series will be the last one, more than likely, of the series. Anyway, thanks for being here and stay safe.